What if the only way to know who truly loved you was to lose absolutely everything? Imagine realizing the wealth you spent decades building just turned your kids into strangers. Elias Thorne was a guy carved straight out of stone and ice. Long before he became a billionaire, he was out there building a massive timber empire with his bare hands. He knew exactly what it meant to starve, to freeze, and to fight for every single breath. He survived in a world that basically wanted him dead. But his 3 kids? They didn't know a thing about that life. They were raised in this bubble of sprawling estates, private flights, and just endless privilege. They'd never felt the bite of a 50 below zero wind. They had no clue what the terrifying silence of a totally empty wilderness actually felt like. As Elias hit his late 70s, this really dark realization started creeping in. All that massive success he built, it had actually become a curse. He watched his oldest son, Julian, run the family hedge funds with this cold, ruthless arrogance. The guy cared way more about profits than actual people. Then there was his daughter, Clara. Her whole existence was just wrapped up in high society, keeping up appearances, and playing these shallow social games. And Silas, he was the youngest, the quiet one, who just wanted to fix up old boats. Elias was always hardest on him, pushing him away for not being corporate enough. The whole family was fractured, just waiting around for the old man to die. They didn't love him. They loved the empire. So Elias decided to burn it all down. The takedown was fast and completely fake. Elias made it look like the Thorne Empire collapsed overnight. Bank accounts locked down, and mansions were suddenly gone. The panic hit the kids hard. Julian was locked out of his funds, his perfect world shattering. He paced his office, screaming into the phone and threatening to sue everybody. Clara had a total meltdown when her high society life vanished. Her designer gear didn't mean a thing anymore. She sobbed in her fancy foyer while movers boxed up her life. The real shocker came 3 days later. Say, a courier dropped off a beat-up envelope for each of the kids. It was a handwritten letter from their dad, which was crazy. The handwriting was shaky, and the ink was smeared like it got wet. Elias wrote that he was broke and running from the feds. He was hiding in an old, busted cabin. But it got worse. He was begging for his life. He said his truck died, he broke his leg, and he was freezing. He pleaded with them to save him. Julian read the letter in his empty penthouse and scoffed. To him, the old man was just a criminal. He tossed it into the fire, not risking his own neck. Clara read it and cried, but only for herself. The cops told her going out there was an emotional distress mission. She took that as an out, totally fine letting him die. Silas got his letter in his freezing apartment. He stared at that shaky handwriting, thinking about how his dad pushed him away. He had every reason to just walk away. But as Silas looked out at the storm clouds, it hit him. Despite the bad blood, that was his dad, dying alone. Right then, Silas knew what he had to do. I picked up the phone and called Julian, hoping he'd actually care. He answered, but his voice was just ice cold. I begged him to help me hire a rescue crew, but he just laughed, told me the old man was getting what he deserved, and hung up. So I called Clara next, praying she'd help. But she just said the cops called it emotional distress mission. She told me it was hopeless, and to just let it go. When the line went dead, it hit me. I was the only one left. No survival training, no fancy gear, just my truck, my coat, and a gut feeling I had to go. I tore through my apartment, grabbing whatever I could. Stuffed a bag with every wool sweater I owned, threw in some flares and whatever food I had. I zipped up my coat, ready for the worst. I threw my gear in the truck and headed north. It was a brutal 14-hour drive, and the weather kept getting worse. The highways disappeared under a thick layer of snow. The sky turned an ugly gray as the storm hit. The roads quickly turned into unplowed logging trails. Snow fell so hard, my headlights just bounced off a wall of white. I leaned over the wheel, barely able to see. The cold was already creeping into the cab. I watched the temperature gauge on the dash freefall. 50 miles from nowhere, I hit a massive hidden snowdrift. The truck jerked hard and slid right off the trail. We slammed into a frozen bank with an awful crunch. Snow packed straight into the grill, choking the engine. The engine sputtered, choked on the snow, and just died. I twisted the key, praying for a spark. Just a weak click. Nothing else. I was trapped, and the wind outside was starting to howl. I grabbed my GPS, my hands already shaking. 22 miles. I was still 22 miles from the cabin. 22 miles in a historic blizzard? The cab was freezing fast. If I stayed in that seat, I'd die. This is the moment where the reality of the wilderness shatters the illusion of control. Most people would just stay in the vehicle. They'd wrap themselves up and wait for a rescue that's never coming. Silas knew staying in the truck meant freezing to death. But stepping out into that storm? That was practically a death sentence, too. He thought of his father, shivering in the dark with a shattered leg. He made his choice. He zipped his heavy canvas coat all the way up to his chin. He pulled on 2 thick pairs of wool gloves to protect his hands. The temperature inside the cab was already plummeting. He shouldered his heavy duffel bag and braced himself. With a deep breath, he kicked the truck door open. The wind hit him instantly like a physical blow. It was a suffocating, violent force that stole the breath right from his lungs. The sheer power of the blizzard threatened to push him right back inside. He stepped out and immediately sank into thigh-deep snow. The cold out there wasn't just the temperature. It felt like an aggressive, living entity clawing at his exposed face. Every single step forward turned into an exhausting, agonizing effort. He had to fight against massive, heavy drifts just to move. He began to walk, pushing his body to its absolute limits. The human body is a furnace, but it needs fuel. Pushing through deep snow is incredibly demanding. Within the first mile, he was already sweating heavily beneath his layers. And in this environment, that's incredibly dangerous. This is the deadliest trap of winter survival. Sweat is moisture, and moisture in sub-zero temperatures is a death sentence. If he stopped moving, that sweat would freeze right against his skin. His core temperature would plummet, bringing on severe hypothermia in minutes. He had to carefully manage his pace, fast enough to make progress, but slow enough to not overheat. The forest around him was a chaotic blur of whipping pine branches and driving snow. He was navigating almost completely blindly through the whiteout. He had to rely entirely on a small compass and a crude map tucked inside his coat. He checked them constantly, praying he was still on course. By the 5th mile, the sun had fully set. The wilderness was instantly plunged into an absolute terrifying darkness.
The temperature dropped even further without the sun.
The isolation of the frozen taiga became overwhelmingly oppressive. He was completely alone in the dark. The only light came from the weak beam of his small flashlight. It barely penetrated the swirling blizzard. In the pitch black, every shadow looked like a predator. The wind howling through the trees sounded eerily like human screams. His legs were burning, and his muscles were cramping from high-stepping through the drifts. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shifted. He had unknowingly wandered off the solid earth. He was standing right on the snow-covered surface of the Bloodroot River.
Before his exhausted brain could even register the danger, he heard it.
A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the dart. The ice was giving way. The ice gives way, and I plunged straight through. Freezing water swallows my right leg up to the knee. Shock is absolutely paralyzing. It feels like 1,000 burning needles driving right into my flesh. Adrenaline floods my system in a split second. I know if I go fully under, I'm dead. I throw all my weight backward, rolling onto the thicker ice. I desperately drag my soaked leg out of that dark water. I scramble back to the tree line, my heart just hammering against my ribs. I'm in immediate, critical danger now. Out here, at -30 degrees, water doesn't just make you cold. It freezes your clothes solid in seconds. My pants are turning into a literal cast of ice. It's rapidly draining the heat right out of my femoral artery. I've got maybe 10 minutes before frostbite destroys my foot. And maybe an hour before hypothermia shuts down my organs completely. I throw off my backpack with numb, clumsy hands. I have to build a fire, and I gotta do it right now. But the wind is just relentless. It keeps blowing away my frantic attempts to gather dry pine needles. My fingers are stiffening up, losing all their fine motor skills. It's the cruel physiology of the cold. Your body pulls warm blood away from your extremities to protect your vital organs. It renders your hands useless right when you need them the most. I've fumbled with my lighter in the dark. I spark it once, but the howling wind instantly blows it out. I spark it again, and nothing happens. Pure panic starts clawing at my mind as the freezing darkness closes in. I force myself to stop and just breathe. I try to remember the survival books I read as a kid. I can't let the panic win. I use my body to shield the wind, crouching low over some birch bark I stripped from a tree. With trembling, nearly frozen fingers, I strike the lighter one more time. A tiny, fragile flame catches the edge of the bark. In that moment, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. A tiny spark of life in this desolate, freezing wilderness. I cup the tiny flame like it's the most precious thing in the world. I gently blow on it, feeding it tiny twigs. The fire slowly grows, crackling and fighting against the wind. But it holds, giving me one desperate chance to survive the night. I finally got the fire going, but I wasn't out of the woods yet. My right boot was basically a block of ice. I had to rip it off before the frostbite set in deep. My foot was completely numb. It looked pale and waxy, like it didn't even belong to me. I just started rubbing it as hard as I could. The pain of the blood rushing back was absolutely blinding. I sat there for hours in the pitch black, just feeding the fire and drying my clothes piece by piece.
I survived the river, yeah.
But it drained almost everything I had left in the tank.
I was still 15 miles away from the cabin.
And the wind was picking back up. There was no way I'd survive the night just sitting out in the open. I had to get out of the wind. I found this massive snowdrift banked up against a fallen pine. I grabbed a thick piece of bark and just started digging. Snow is actually a crazy good insulator if you do it right. I just needed a hole big enough to hide in. My arms felt like lead. Every scoop of snow took so much effort. But I managed to hollow out a tiny cave, just barely big enough to squeeze my body into. I crawled inside the snow cave. I dragged my duffel bag in right behind me to block the wing. Once that hole was plugged, It went completely pitch black. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The silence under the snow was deafening. You couldn't hear the storm roaring above anymore. But the cold was still there. I was shivering so violently, I thought my teeth were going to crack. My stomach was twisting itself into knots. I was burning so many calories just trying to stay alive. I pulled out a granola bar from my pocket. But the thing was frozen solid like a brick. I couldn't even bite into it. I had to shove the frozen bars under my armpits, just hoping my body heat would thaw them out enough to eat. It was going to be a really long night. As the long hours of the night dragged on, the darkness started playing tricks on him. Hallucinations began to creep into the edges of his mind. He could hear his brother Julian's voice, mocking him from the shadows. Then Clara, telling him to just close his eyes and go to sleep. The voices echoed in that tiny, freezing space. The urge to simply let go, to stop fighting the cold, was incredibly seductive. Hypothermia doesn't kill you with pain. It kills you with apathy. It wraps you in this warm, heavy blanket of exhaustion. It whispers that everything's gonna be all right if you just rest for a second. To fight the sleep, Silas forced himself to focus on his dad. He pictured Elias, a man who had built an absolute empire, now reduced to a broken, freezing body on a cabin floor. He remembered a time when he was 10 years old. He'd fallen off a dock into the freezing ocean water. His dad had pulled him out, stripped off his own heavy coat, and wrapped it around him. He carried him 2 miles back to the house. It was the only time Silas could vividly remember feeling completely safe in his father's arms. He clung to that memory. He used it as fuel. He wasn't going to let the man who carried him die alone in the snow. When morning finally broke, the storm had lessened a bit, but the cold had deepened into something sharp and brittle. Silas violently kicked his way out of the snow cave. He broke through the icy crust into the pale daylight. His body was stiff, agonizingly sore, and totally depleted. His right foot throbbed with the dull, aching pain of mild frostbite. Every time he forced his weight onto it, it sent a shock up his leg. He still had 12 miles left to go, and the terrain was shifting from flat forest to the steep, jagged incline of Blackwood Ridge. The wind up here was unobstructed. It hit him with the force of a freight train. The second day was a brutal exercise in sheer human endurance. Every single step required a conscious command from his brain. Lift the leg, push through the snow, plant the foot, shift the weight. Breathe and repeat. The wind up on the ridge was like a freight train. Ice crystals literally froze to his eyelashes, blinding him. He kept having to wipe his eyes, rubbing his skin raw in the freezing wind. By mid-afternoon, his body was just shutting down. He was literally burning through his own muscle tissue for energy. He kept stumbling, falling to his knees every few yards. He was gasping for thin, freezing air. The landscape was just a blinding whiteout. Then, a sinking horror hit him. He'd lost the trail. His GPS coordinates were jumping wildly, completely unable to find a signal through the storm. He was miles from anywhere, completely out of energy. And the sun was starting to dip below the horizon again. He fell forward into the snow. He just didn't have the strength to push himself back up. This was it. This was where it ended. He'd given everything he had, but the wilderness was just too powerful. His vision started to blur into a hazy gray. But as his vision faded, he caught something unnatural in the landscape. A straight line. Nature doesn't make perfectly straight lines. Slowly, agonizingly, he dragged his head up. 30 yards away, half buried in the snow, was an old wooden post. It had a rusted metal ring attached to it. It was a trail marker. One of the original markers his dad drove into the rock 50 years ago. A violent surge of adrenaline tore through his body. It was that primal, desperate energy of a trapped animal seeing a way out. He didn't have the strength to stand. So instead, he started to crawl. He dragged his body through the deep snow,
Pulling himself forward with his elbows, his fingers digging into the ice.
He crawled past the first mortar.
Then a second.
Finally, the tree line broke. It revealed a small clearing near the summit of the ridge. And there it was, standing dark and silent against the white snow, was the cabin. I just stood there, staring at this dark, silent box.
All that fighting, all that pain. And I was too late.
It looked like a tomb buried in the snow. I thought I'd just walked through hell to find a frozen grave. I didn't even have the strength to stand up straight. I dragged myself up those wooden steps, just running on fumes. My hands were so numb I couldn't even feel the iron handle. I just threw my entire body weight against the door. The door finally gave way with this loud creak. I just collapsed right across the threshold. I hit the floorboards face first and couldn't move. I was just lying there, gasping for air, waiting to die. I braced myself for the freezing cold of an empty room, but the cold never came.
It was warm.
Unbelievably, impossibly warm. This wave of heat just washed right over my frozen face. My brain couldn't even process what was happening. I slowly pushed myself up, thinking I was hallucinating. I thought it was just a final trick of a dying mind. But then I smelled burning cedar and meat stew. I opened my eyes, and the room was completely real. It wasn't some broken-down shack. It was immaculate, lined with stacked firewood and insulation. There were these high-end lanterns everywhere, glowing bright gold. There was a massive stone fireplace roaring in the center of the room. And sitting right there in a leather armchair was my father, just sitting about to fine. He wasn't hurt. His leg wasn't shattered. He wasn't freezing to death. He was wearing this thick wool sweater, looking completely fine. Not a single scratch on him. He was just holding a mug of hot coffee. He looked down at me, and his face just completely fell. He looked absolutely shattered, like he was looking at a ghost. He never actually expected me to make it. For a second, nobody said a word. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I stared at his perfectly healthy legs. I saw the stew, the satellite phone on the table.
And then all that confusion just turned into pure, blinding rage.
You're alive. He choked the words out. His voice was just a raspy, broken whisper. He couldn't process what he was seeing. Elias stood up slowly.
He set his mug down, his hands shaking.
He had built this whole test. But seeing his son like this, the reality of what he'd done just crashed down on him. Silas, he whispered. His voice cracked under the weight of it all. He took a step forward. Say the natural American voice, stripping away the myth. The billionaire was gone. Now he was just a father, horrified by what he'd caused. You lied, Silas said. He pushed himself up onto his knees. His whole body was screaming in pain.
The bankruptcy. The letter.
You lied about all of it!
The betrayal cut deeper than the cold ever could.
I had to know, Elias pleaded.
Tears spilled over his weathered cheeks.
I had to know if any of it was real.
If any of you were real. His stoic facade completely crumbled.
Silas let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob.
He dragged himself to his feet, swaying heavily.
I almost died out there, he screamed.
All that raw emotion finally tore out of him.
I fell through the ice.
I froze in a tritch.
I came here to drag you out on my back, and you were sitting by a fire?
The sheer injustice of it echoed off the walls.
Elias didn't even try to defend himself.
He just stepped forward.
And he did something Silas hadn't seen in 20 years.
The billionaire fell to his knees.
Right in front of his youngest son.
He grabbed Silas's frozen coat.
He buried his face in the icy canvas.
He started sobbing with heavy, chest-heaving grief.
I'm sorry,
he wept.
I'm so deeply, terribly sorry.
I'm just a foolish, broken old man.
He looked up, tears streaming down his face.
I thought the money ruined all of you.
Julian didn't come. And Clara didn't come. But you came into the dark.
You proved me wrong, Silas.
You're the only thing that's real.
The anger in Silas's chest fought a losing battle.
This was the terrifying patriarch who ruled their lives,
now reduced to a weeping father, begging for forgiveness. Silas looked around the warm, brightly lit room.
His eyes locked onto the satellite phone on the table.
A rescue team could have been called in minutes. He didn't have the energy to yell anymore. The last drop of adrenaline just vanished. Silas collapsed backward onto the floor, his body completely failing him. Elias moved instantly, scrambling to his feet. He grabbed the satellite phone and started shouting orders, calling in the private medevac team he had waiting on standby. He rushed back to Silas, dropping to his knees. He frantically stripped away the wet, frozen layers, tearing off that heavy canvas coat to stop the hypothermia. He wrapped Silas in heavy, heated blankets, cradling his grown son against his chest by the fire, pouring everything he had into keeping him alive.
Elias held a mug of warm broth to his trembling lips,
coaxing him to drink, slow and steady. The terrifying billionaire was just a father now, nursing his boy. For the next 2 days, the storm raged outside. But inside, they just sat together by the fire. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore.
It was the quiet peace of two survivors.
Elias finally explained the whole truth. The empire was completely intact.
The bankruptcy was just a legal trick to test them.
He risked it all to see who really cared. And now he knew.
When the storm finally broke, the winds died down.
A heavy military transport chopper descended on the clearing, blowing a hurricane of white powder into the air. It was time to go home. Elias and Silas boarded the heavy transport chopper, finally leaving that frozen hell behind them. The brutal, deadly survival test was officially over, and they were heading home. Back in the city, the financial freeze was suddenly lifted without warning. Julian celebrated in his penthouse, thinking the old man had somehow beat the federal indictments. He was right back to his arrogant, smug self, completely untouched by the storm.
Clara threw lavish parties, bragging to her rich friends about how tough she was during the temporary hardship.
They were both completely clueless about the nightmare that had actually happened out in the snow. A week later, Julian and Clara got called up to the towering Thorne Industries boardroom. They strutted in, fully expecting to get their massive portfolios and fancy titles handed right back to them.
But instead of a warm welcome, they were shocked to see Silas sitting at the head of the table. His face was scarred and peeling from severe frostbite, and his foot was wrapped in a heavy medical boot.
Elias stood by the window, looking at his eldest kids with cold, dead eyes. He handed them each a single, thin file. Inside was just a modest trust fund. Enough to live on, but absolutely no power, no equity, and no legacy.
He told them they had failed the only test that ever mattered. When he was dying, they counted their losses.
When he was freezing, they stayed warm and comfortable. Julian completely lost it, screaming about his birthright and all his years managing the company. Clara broke down into theatrical hysterics, begging and claiming she was just too scared of the storm. But the words were totally hollow, and the truth was already written.
Elias turned his back on them for good.
He pointed to Silas and said everything he built now belonged to the man willing to walk through hell for him. Security stepped in and escorted Julian and Clara out of the building, permanently exiling them. Silas sat there looking at the massive stacks of documents transferring billions into his name. But honestly, he didn't care about the money at all. He looked at his dad, who finally looked at peace. They had lost the rest of the family. But out in that freezing dark, they had finally found each other. He looked at the massive stacks of legal documents. Billions of dollars were being transferred right into his name. But honestly, he didn't care about the money at all. He had learned a brutal lesson out there in the deep, freezing dark. When you're miles from nowhere, money cannot start a fire. It's just paper. All the wealth in the world can't keep the wind from stopping your heart. Nature doesn't care about your bank account. It only respects what you have inside. And when your body completely fails you, a fortune cannot carry you when your legs finally give out. You have to find a reason to keep crawling. Back in that sterile room, he looked up at his father. The old man looked incredibly tired. But for the first time in his entire life, he actually looked at peace. That massive fortune had always been a giant wall between them. But the brutal reality of the wilderness had finally torn it down. Silas had lost his brother and his sister, but he had survived the impossible. And out there in the frozen, unforgiving cold, he had finally found his father.
So, what would you have done?
If the person who hurt you the most begged for your help from the edge of the abyss, would you risk your own life to save theirs? Would you actually walk into the blizzard? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you want to hear more harrowing stories of human endurance and betrayal, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon. Until next time, stay safe out there. And never underestimate the sheer power of the human spirit. Julian was handed a life of quiet mediocrity. Stripped of his bespoke suits in his corner office, he was left with nothing but his own bitter resentment. Clara found herself exiled from the high society circles she had spent her entire life cultivating. Without the Thorne fortune behind her, the invitations simply stopped coming. They had spent decades waiting for the old man to die so they could inherit the earth. Instead, they were permanently locked out of the empire they worshipped. As for Silas, inheriting billions of dollars didn't change who he was. He didn't move into the penthouse, and he didn't buy a fleet of private jets. He kept his hands dirty because he knew that the soft comforts of extreme wealth were exactly what had poisoned his family in the first place. Elias finally stepped away from the company he had built with his bare hands. The heavy burden of his legacy was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound peace. The massive fortune had always been an impenetrable wall between them, But it took a Category 5 blizzard and a brush with death to finally tear that wall down. The wilderness is a brutal, unforgiving judge.
It doesn't care about your bank account, your stock portfolio, or your social status.
It only respects what you can endure. When the temperature drops to 30 below zero, all those modern illusions are stripped away.
You are left with nothing but the absolute truth.
And in the freezing dark of Blackwood Ridge, the truth was finally revealed.
A family was broken, but a father and son were saved from the ice. What's the real takeaway from the Thorne family's collapse?
It's a harsh reminder of how fragile our empires are.
Money couldn't buy real loyalty when the cold hit.
It stripped away the comfortable illusions we live with.
In the end, only two things actually mattered:
Human endurance and the willingness to suffer for someone else.
The wilderness doesn't care about your bank account.
It only respects the fire you carry inside.
Which brings us to the ultimate question.
The same question Elias forced his kids to answer.
It's easy to judge Julian and Clara from our warm living rooms.
But this story forces us to look in the mirror.
What would you have done if you got that letter?
If the person who hurt you the most, the one who completely ruined your life, suddenly begged for your help from the edge of the abyss, would you find it in your heart to forgive them?
Would you risk your own safety to pull them back? Or would you just let the past dictate their fate?
Would you leave the safety of your home and drive into the unknown? Would you step out of your truck and walk into a Category 5 blizzard for someone who didn't deserve it?
It's a scenario that tests the limits of human empathy.
I really want to hear your honest thoughts on this.
Drop down into the comments and let me know.
How would you have handled Elias Thorne's test? The world is full of stories where people are pushed past their breaking points. If you want to hear more tales of human endurance, bitter betrayal, and the dark side of extreme wealth,
then you're in the right place.
we explore the extremes of what people are capable of when everything is on the line. Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss an episode of these intense survival sagas. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the frozen taiga. Remember, our greatest strength isn't in our wallets. It's in our willpower. Until next time, stay safe out there and never underestimate the power of the human spirit.